I remember the day we got married as if it were yesterday. The sun was shining, and everything felt perfect, as if the world itself had paused to celebrate our love. We were young, full of dreams, and eager to build a life together. Our love was the kind of love that made you believe in fairy tales, the kind that makes you feel invincible, life was good in the beginning. We moved into a small but cozy apartment in the city, decorated with mismatched furniture and the kind of enthusiasm that only newlyweds can muster. We were both working, and while we didn't have much, we had each other, and that felt like more than enough. I was in love with my husband, and every day felt like a new adventure. But as the saying goes, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. The first cracks in our perfect life appeared when my husband lost his job. It wasn't his fault, downsizing, they called it, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. He fell into a deep depression, and I was left trying to hold everything together. I took on extra shifts at work, trying to keep us afloat, but the strain of being the sole breadwinner was wearing me down. Our home, once filled with laughter and love, started to feel more like a prison. My husband retreated into himself, barely speaking to me, and when he did, it was only to express his frustration and anger. I tried to be patient, to be understanding, but it was hard. The man I married was disappearing before my eyes, and I felt powerless to stop it, I couldn't help but feel increasingly isolated. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering where it all went wrong. I missed the man I fell in love with, the man who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt. But now, all that was left was a stranger lying next to me, and I was starting to question if our love was strong enough to survive this. It was around this time that my husband suggested his stepson move in with us. He had a son from a previous marriage, a young man in his early 20s, who had always been a bit of a mystery to me. My husband and his son had a complex relationship, marked by long periods of silence and awkward attempts at connection. But with the way things were going, my husband thought it would be a good idea to have him around. Maybe it would help, he said, at first, I was hesitant. Our relationship was already strained, and adding another person into the mix felt like it could make things worse. But my husband was insistent, and I eventually relented. I told myself that maybe it would help, maybe having someone else around would take some of the pressure off. Little did I know, that decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change our lives forever, when he arrived, it was clear that this wasn't going to be easy. The tension between my husband and his stepson was palpable, an unspoken history hanging in the air. I could see the awkwardness in their interactions, the strained attempts at conversation that never quite felt natural, his name was Alex, and despite the awkwardness between him and my husband, he was surprisingly easy to talk to. He had a calm, reassuring presence, the kind that made you feel comfortable without even trying. He was polite, helpful around the house, and seemed genuinely grateful to have a place to stay. I found myself appreciating his company more than I expected. As the weeks went by, the dynamics in our household began to shift. My husband, still lost in his own world, spent most of his time in front of the TV or sleeping. Alex and I, on the other hand, started to develop a bond. It started with small things, sharing a cup of coffee in the morning, talking about our days in the evening, but soon, those small moments became something I looked forward to, there was a kindness in Alex that I hadn't felt in a long time. He listened when I talked, really listened, in a way that my husband hadn't in months. He asked about my day, noticed when I was tired, and offered to help with the chores without me having to ask. It was refreshing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt seen, but as our connection grew, so did the guilt. I knew it wasn't right to feel this way about Alex. He was my husband's stepson, for God's sake, and I was married. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore the attraction that was building between us. It wasn't just physical, though that was part of it, it was emotional. He made me feel understood, valued, something I had been craving for so long, one evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, I came home to find Alex in the kitchen, cooking dinner. My husband was out, he had started going to the bar more frequently, something I tried not to think too much about. Alex greeted me with a smile, a warm, genuine smile that made my heart skip a beat, I thought you could use a break, he said, handing me a glass of wine, I took the glass, our fingers brushing briefly as I did. It was such a small, innocent touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I tried to ignore it, tried to push down the feelings that were bubbling up inside me, but it was no use. That night, as we sat together at the kitchen table, talking and laughing over dinner, I felt something shift between us. There was a moment, just a fleeting second, when our eyes met, and I saw something in his gaze that mirrored my own feelings. It was desire, yes, but also something deeper, a connection, a shared understanding of the loneliness we both felt. I knew I was walking a dangerous line, but I couldn't bring myself to step back. I told myself it was harmless, that we were just two people finding comfort in each other's company. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to my husband snore beside me, I couldn't stop thinking about Alex, about the way he made me feel alive again, the line between friendship and something more was blurring, and I was losing control. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, longer conversations, more lingering glances, a touch that lingered just a bit too long. But then, one night, everything changed, it was late, and my husband was out again, leaving Alex and me alone in the house. We were sitting on the couch, watching a movie, though I couldn't tell you what it was. My mind was elsewhere, my thoughts tangled in the web of emotions I had been trying so hard to deny, as the credits rolled, I turned to Alex, intending to say something, anything, to break the tension that had been building between us. But before I could speak, he leaned in and kissed me. It was soft, tentative, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I kissed him back, my heart pounding in my chest. In that moment, all the guilt, all the reasons why this was wrong, melted away. All I could think about was how much I needed this, needed him. It wasn't just about the physical attraction, though that was undeniably there, it was about the connection we had formed, the way he made me feel understood in a way I hadn't felt in a long time, we spent the night together, and it was everything I had imagined it would be. But when the morning came, so did the guilt. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, reality crashing down on me. What had I done? How could I have let this happen? Alex stirred beside me, and when our eyes met, I saw the same mix of emotions reflected in his gaze, desire, guilt, and something else, something I couldn't quite name, we shouldn't have done this, I whispered, more to myself than to him, I know, he replied, his voice heavy with regret. But we can't take it back now, I nodded, my mind racing. What now? How could we go back to the way things were? But even as I thought it, I knew that was impossible. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back, over the next few days, I tried to distance myself from Alex, to put some space between us. But it was easier said than done. We still lived under the same roof, and every time I saw him, I felt that same pull, that same undeniable connection. And as much as I tried to deny it, a part of me didn't want to stop, but the guilt was eating away at me, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I just didn't know how or when, it wasn't long before my husband started to notice the change. He wasn't oblivious, and though he had been distant, he still knew me well enough to sense that something was off. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the suspicion growing in his eyes. But he didn't say anything, not at first. Maybe he didn't want to believe it, or maybe he was too lost in his own misery to confront it, but one evening, after another long day at work, I came home to find him sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know, he knew. My heart sank, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me, we need to talk, he said, his voice slurred but sharp, I sat down across from him, my hands trembling. What about, he didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another swig of whiskey, his eyes never leaving mine. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with a quiet anger that scared me more than if he had yelled, I know something's going on between you and Alex, I opened my mouth to deny it, to lie, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat there, silent, my heart pounding in my chest. You think I'm stupid, he continued, his voice rising. You think I haven't noticed the way you look at him? The way you've been avoiding me? I may be depressed, but I'm not blind, tears welled up in my eyes, and I looked down at the table, unable to meet his gaze. I'm sorry, I whispered, but even to my ears, the words felt hollow, sorry, he echoed, laughing bitterly. That's all you have to say? Sorry, I didn't know what to say, what to do. I had never seen him like this, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I had underestimated the depth of his feelings, the extent of the damage I had done, I trusted you, he said, his voice breaking. I trusted you, and you betrayed me, the pain in his voice cut through me like a knife, and I felt a wave of shame and regret crash over me. I had done this, and now I had to face the consequences, he stood up, knocking the chair over in the process, and for a moment, I thought he was going to leave. But then he turned back to me, his face twisted with anger and hurt, I want him out, he said, his voice cold. I want him out of this house, out of our lives. And if you care about saving what's left of our marriage, you'll do it, I nodded, unable to speak. What else could I do? I had already destroyed so much, and now all I could do was try to pick up the pieces, that night, I told Alex he had to leave. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, but I knew it was the right thing. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. He just nodded, a look of deep sadness in his eyes, and packed his things, as he walked out the door, I felt a pang of loss so intense it took my breath away. But I knew this was the end, the only way to salvage what was left of my marriage. Or so I thought, in the days that followed, the house felt eerily quiet. My husband and I spoke only when necessary, our conversations clipped and devoid of any real emotion. It was as if we were both afraid to acknowledge the reality of what had happened, afraid that doing so would shatter the fragile truce we had managed to establish, I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the emptiness that seemed to have settled over my life. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Alex. I missed him more than I cared to admit, missed the way he made me feel, missed the connection we had shared, but I had made my choice, and now I had to live with it, One evening, about a week after Alex had left, I came home to find my husband waiting for me in the living room. He had that same bottle of whiskey in front of him, but this time, he hadn't touched it, We need to talk, he said, echoing the words he had spoken that night in the kitchen, I nodded, my heart sinking. I knew this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier, He gestured for me to sit down, and I did, my hands twisting nervously in my lap. I've been doing a lot of thinking, he began, his voice surprisingly calm. About us, about everything that's happened, I nodded again, not trusting myself to speak. I don't know if we can come back from this, he continued, his eyes fixed on the floor. But I'm willing to try, if you are, I looked at him, surprised. You want to try, he nodded. I still love you, he said simply. Despite everything, I still love you. And I want to believe that we can work through this, that we can find our way back to each other, tears filled my eyes, and I felt a surge of hope. Maybe we could fix this, maybe we could rebuild what we had lost, but then he said something that stopped me in my tracks, I've also been talking to someone, he said, his voice hesitant. A woman I met at the bar. Nothing happened, he added quickly, seeing the look on my face. But we've been talking, and she's been helping me through all of this, I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. He had found someone else, someone to confide in, to lean on. And while nothing had happened, it still felt like a betrayal, like he was moving on without me, I needed someone to talk to, he said, his voice almost apologetic. Someone who wasn't involved in all of this. I didn't mean to hurt you, but I think it's only fair that you know, I nodded, my mind racing. What did this mean for us? Could we really rebuild our marriage with this new complication hanging over us? My story isn't over yet. Please consider subscribing to the channel, thank you. Back to the story. As I sat there, grappling with my emotions, I realized that the situation was more complicated than I had ever imagined. And I knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, as the days turned into weeks, my husband and I tried to piece our lives back together. It wasn't easy, there were moments when the pain and anger bubbled to the surface, threatening to tear us apart all over again. But we kept trying, holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could make it work. But as we worked on our marriage, there was something else nagging at me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit, a lingering doubt that I couldn't shake, and then, one day, everything became clear, I was cleaning out the closet when I found it, an old photo album tucked away on the top shelf. It was from my husband's first marriage, filled with pictures of a life I had only heard about in passing. I sat down on the floor and began flipping through the pages, curious to learn more about the man I thought I knew so well. But as I reached the end of the album, something caught my eye. A photograph, slightly crumpled, slipped between the pages. I pulled it out and stared at it, my heart skipping a beat. It was a picture of my husband, much younger, standing next to a woman I recognized immediately, his ex-wife. But that wasn't what shocked me. No, it was the boy standing next to them, the boy with the same dark eyes and solemn expression. Alex. I stared at the picture, my mind racing. This couldn't be right. Alex was my husband's stepson, not his biological son. That's what he had always told me, what I had always believed, but as I looked at the photograph, at the unmistakable resemblance between them, a horrible realization began to take shape in my mind, I rushed downstairs, the photograph clutched in my hand, and confronted my husband. I showed him the picture, demanding an explanation, he stared at it for a long moment, his face pale, before finally looking up at me, I didn't want you to know, he said quietly. I thought it would be easier if you didn't, easier? I echoed, my voice shaking. You lied to me. You let me believe that Alex was your stepson, not your biological son. Why? Why would you do that? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because I was ashamed. Ashamed of how things ended with his mother, ashamed of how I handled everything. And when I met you, I wanted a fresh start. I didn't want my past to get in the way, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the truth sank in. Alex wasn't just my husband's stepson, he was his son. His biological son. And I had slept with him, the room spun around me, and I felt like I was going to be sick. How could this have happened? How could I have been so blind? My husband reached out to me, but I pulled away, unable to bear his touch. Don't, I whispered, my voice trembling. Just don't, I turned and walked away, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I felt betrayed, disgusted, and most of all, lost. Everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down, and I didn't know how to move forward, In the days that followed, I struggled to come to terms with everything that had happened. My marriage was in tatters, my sense of self shattered. I didn't know who I was anymore, didn't know how to reconcile the choices I had made with the person I thought I was, but life doesn't stop, even when you feel like your world is falling apart. And slowly, painfully, I began to pick up the pieces, my husband and I decided to take a break, to give each other the space we needed to heal. He moved out, and for the first time in years, I found myself alone. It was terrifying, but also liberating in a way. I had spent so much time trying to hold everything together, trying to be everything for everyone, that I had lost sight of myself, in the silence of my empty house, I began to confront the things I had been running from, the loneliness, the guilt, the fear. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wanted to give up, to crawl into bed and never come out. But I didn't. I kept going, one day at a time, I started seeing a therapist, someone who could help me untangle the mess of emotions inside me. It was hard, painful work, but slowly, I began to understand why I had made the choices I had. I began to forgive myself, my husband and I stayed in touch, though our conversations were tentative, careful. We were both hurting, both trying to figure out who we were without each other. But there was a part of me that still loved him, that still hoped we could find our way back to each other, as for Alex, I never saw him again. He left town shortly after everything came to light, and I heard through the grapevine that he was trying to start over somewhere new. I wished him well, but I knew that our chapter was closed. Whatever connection we had shared, whatever comfort we had found in each other, it was over, months passed, and slowly, I began to rebuild my life. I found new hobbies, reconnected with old friends, and started to rediscover the person I had been before everything fell apart. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of what had happened threatened to crush me. But I kept going, because I knew I had to, eventually, my husband and I met up for coffee. It was awkward at first, both of us unsure of what to say, how to act. But as we talked, as we shared our experiences of the past few months, something shifted. We weren't the same people we had been, but there was still a connection, still something worth fighting for, we decided to take things slow, to see if we could rebuild what we had lost. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were no guarantees. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful, rebuilding our marriage was the hardest thing I've ever done. There were days when it felt impossible, when the pain and the betrayal seemed too much to overcome. But we kept going, kept talking, kept trying, we went to couples therapy, something I never thought we'd do, but it helped. It gave us a space to be honest, to confront the things we had been avoiding for so long. It wasn't always pretty, and there were times when I wondered if it was worth it. But slowly, painfully, we began to heal, it wasn't just about forgiving each other, it was about forgiving ourselves. We had both made mistakes, both hurt each other in ways that seemed unforgivable. But we had also shared so much, built a life together, and that was worth fighting for, as the months went by, we started to find our way back to each other. It wasn't the same as it had been before, there were scars that would never fully heal, wounds that would always be there. But there was also a new understanding, a deeper connection that came from surviving the storm together, we learned to communicate in ways we never had before, to be honest with each other about our needs and our fears. It wasn't easy, and there were times when we stumbled, when old wounds reopened and threatened to pull us apart. But we kept going, kept fighting, because we knew that what we had was worth it, in the end, we came out stronger. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was ours. We had been through hell and back, but we had survived. And in that survival, we found a new kind of love, one that was deeper and more resilient than anything we had known before. As I sit here now, looking back on everything that has happened, I realize that our story isn't over. We're still writing it, every day, together. And while there are still challenges ahead, I know that we can face them, because we've already faced the worst and come out the other side. Love isn't always easy, and sometimes it hurts more than you think you can bear. But it's also worth fighting for, worth holding on to, even when everything seems lost. And as we move forward, hand in hand, I know that we're ready to face whatever comes next, together.